Well, good morning again. I'm sorry there was no video clip this morning, but I just couldn't find one that would fit. Oh well. I got an idea for the introduction to today's sermon from a friend of mine, David Ramsey, who is pastor at Rock Springs Church in Cortez, Colorado. We were out there, as I shared with you last week. But he said something very similar, and I modified it to fit me, giving credit where credit is due. As most of you know, Chuck Stamper, one of my deacons, newly elected deacons, has been helping me around here and at Marcy's Pantry, the local food bank here in Curtis. Now, he's clearly doing the lion's share of the work. I play a much smaller role or part, but very important. That is the part of supervisor. But still, man, I'm achy and sore. Honestly, I'm weary. Okay, I admit it. I'm pitifully out of shape, unless you consider round a shape. The point is, I'm weary, and maybe you're weary too. Due to the holiday wear and tear that you go through, it just pulls you down, or possibly all the turmoil that's going on in our nation. Or are you worn out from the COVID regulations, wearing a mask, Are you sick and tired of being sick and tired? Are you breaking down under the weight of the world? Well, let me say that if you feel weary, take heed. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." That's the text for today. It's found in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. We're told also in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, "Rejoice in the Lord always." Again, I say rejoice. In other words, Jesus is inviting us to trade weariness for rest, to trade religion for relationship, to trade heavy for light. And that trade is made when we connect directly with Him. I just got to thinking, if we're weary in carrying heavy burdens, and if rejoice means to feel or show great delight, then we should take Jesus up on His offer to trade the heavy for delight. Okay, you can stop groaning and rolling your eyes now. I realize oh well, never mind. Now, Matthew tells us that large crowds came from all over the area of Galilee and were following Jesus here at this point of our text. And at the height of His popularity, Jesus said, you ready for this? "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now, doesn't that seem strange? By the way, that's in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. But doesn't that seem strange? He wants us to be meek. Like many of the teachings of Jesus, the words that he spoke didn't really go along with the popular views of the day. Listen again to what he said. Blessed are the meek. They'll inherit the earth. Now, this certainly isn't the teaching that's found in the business world today. Rather, young people are taught that in order to succeed, you must focus on yourself. Rather, young people are taught that in order to succeed, you must focus on yourself first. If you need to run over a few people to get to the top, go ahead. Success at all cost. That's what's being taught today. Now, these are popular teachings right now in the 21st century. But believe it or not, it was also the same in the first century. Many people then associated power with religion. And so when Jesus became popular among all the people, the religious leaders felt threatened. They were accustomed to being able to force people to do whatever they wanted them to do. They constantly took advantage of the people in an attempt to make life better for themselves. Sounds kind of like politicians today, wouldn't you say? Listen, in the middle of all that, Jesus brings this teaching. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The main problem with this word meekness is that too many people associate it with weakness. Meekness isn't weakness. It's actually best defined as power under control. Moses, the man who stood toe-to-toe with Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world at that time, and took the Israelites, around 3 million of them, through the wilderness around the way to the promised land. He said, or it said of him, that he was very humble, more than all the men who were on the face of the earth. That's Numbers chapter 12, verse 3. Another of Jesus' teachings found in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30, which I've already shared with you, but I'll read it again. For he says, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now let's face it, that's a pretty amazing deal. If this passage, in this passage, Jesus tells us that we must do 3 things. First, come to Jesus. When you face difficulties in life, what you do first speaks volumes about your spiritual life. The Apostle Paul prayed constantly that thorn would be removed from his flesh. Now, it wasn't a physical form, but it was something that was wrong with him. Many people think that it was his eyesight. But he prayed over and over that it would be removed. And when his prayer wasn't answered the way he wanted it to be, he prayed again and again. Now, Job faced one tragedy after another, but he continued to go to the Lord for his strength. Even when things grew worse, Job kept his walk with the Lord. Even as his friends turned against him and even his own wife, he continued to turn to the Lord. Let me ask you, what's the first thing that you do when you receive bad news? Who's the first person you go to? Whatever difficulty we face, our first step should be in the direction of Jesus. Well, the second thing that we must do is put on Jesus' yoke. Now, a yoke, we don't find these today much, and especially here in our society. But a yoke is a wooden beam, normally used between a pair of oxen, to enable them to work together to pull a heavy load. Now, a yoke is rested on the neck of the oxen with a connecting bar to some kind of implement. The oxen were then connected to the plow or the wagon or whatever by this connecting piece of timber, and they would pull it, working together. It's obvious. It was made for two to share the load. It must properly fit both animals, so one doesn't bear too much of the load. If it doesn't fit properly, if it was placed on one animal only, it would hurt that animal. It might even choke it. Paul tells us also that in marriage, two people shouldn't be unequally yoked. And that's a discussion for another time. Also, he speaks of the yoke of bondage. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, he says, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not entangle again with a yoke of bondage." While that may sound like a lot of gobbledygook, let me share this with you. This is a warning. And it is that once you know Christ and are walking in grace, don't return to the law. Don't go back to the law. Paul says, "As you therefore receive Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him." In other words, you started in grace, continue in grace. The word yoke in the Old Testament is a symbol for the law of God. In this passage, Jesus is using it in the same way. Now, listen, this is important. The context here is not between having a yoke or not having a yoke. You see, all of us have a yoke. The contrast here is between having a heavy yoke or a light yoke. The teaching of the scribes had 613 commandments for them to keep. And believe me, they were imposing that on everyone. Now, Jesus offered a much lighter yoke, a yoke of grace for two people, you and him. You see, Jesus says, "Take my yoke." In other words, he's yoked up. "Take my yoke upon you. It's easy, and the burden's light," because he's taken the bulk of the burden. Listen, we have one final thing that we must do. Learn of Jesus. Jesus doesn't force his yoke on us. We take it by choice. We all have a burden to carry. The question is whether we'll struggle with it on our own or share the load with someone. I know that for some of you, the load's been very heavy. You feel strained. You might even say that it feels like more than you can bear. Jesus issues many challenges to his disciples, and us as well. Such things as, he says, put this yoke on. So what do we think of? We think of a burden. Oh, great. Here he is, he's adding to us. No. Listen. A lot of things, if we allow ourselves to think carnally, we think wrong. And with Jesus' teaching, we have a tendency many times to think wrong. He said to the rich man, sell all that you have and give it to the poor. And the rich man said, no way, Jose, I'm not doing that. In reality, what Jesus was telling him is if you'll do this, you'll have much more. You'll have a home in paradise. Jesus also said to follow him, you have to hate your mother, your father, and your family. That sounds strange. And what he's really saying is what you need to do is to love him so much that compared to the love that you have for your own family, it'll be like you hate them. He also said, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. And if you stop reading right there, man, that sounds terrible. Why not just wash it or something? Can't we do that? What he's saying is, if there's anything that hinders you from getting into heaven, do away with it. If your right hand offends you, if it keeps you from getting into heaven, cut it off. Because you're better off going into heaven with one hand than it is. Oh, by the way, you're going to get a whole new body anyway. But listen, he also said, if you're going to follow me, take up my cross. A lot of people think maybe that's wearing a piece of jewelry, but what he's talking about is you need to die to yourself. The cross is beautiful to us today because of he who died on it. It was a symbol of death. The disciples knew following Jesus would cost them their life. It's also a symbol of burden we carry at times. We hear people say, this is my cross to bear. And many people, for them, the Christian life becomes a burden. Something it was never meant to be. To some, it's nothing more than a list of rules, a list of do's and don'ts. It was never intended to be that either. All of this happens because we lose focus, or we put our focus in the wrong place. Now, I have a really good illustration I want to share with you concerning this. It's the story that's been told of a man constantly complaining about the size of the cross that he had to bear. And he was convinced his life was more difficult than anyone else's. No one's gone through what I've experienced, he complained. He thought, if I could only talk to God about it. So an angel appeared to him and took him to a room in heaven where crosses were assigned. The angel told him, look around. And he could pick whatever cross he wanted to bear. The man smiled and went in the room. There he saw crosses of all sizes, some small, some huge. As he walked through the room, he finally noticed 2 crosses over to one side. One was about 3 foot tall, and the other was about 4. So he cried out, "I'll take that one," and pointed to the smallest one. The angel said, "You sure that's the one you want?" The man replied, "Look, you don't know what I've been through. I just can't carry that large cross anymore." The angel said, "Well, the only reason I ask is because that small one is the one you brought with you when you came." Let me ask you, are you still trying to be a Christian all by yourself? My friend, that load's too heavy for anyone, much less you. Maybe it's time you gave a part of it to Jesus. Get in his yoke. It's easy and the burden's light. Now, you can go your own way, or you can yoke up with him and be blessed. Which will it be? Which will you choose? The choice is yours. Well, I trust you'll get in his yoke. Give yourself to him. He'll take care of you. I promise you. He's done that for me for about 40-something years. And, man, I'm glad. Well, I trust that you'll have a wonderful week. Have a blessed week. And until next time, amen.